This is Audible.
Recorded Books Inspirational presents an unabridged recording of The Moment Between by Nicole Baart, narrated by Jennifer Ikeda, and directed by Jenny Lee Brewster. This book is copyrighted 2009 by Nicole Baart. This recording is copyrighted 2009 by Recorded Books, producer and publisher of Recorded Books Inspirational, an imprint dedicated to stories of faith and the human spirit. And now, The Moment Between.
From I Cannot Live With You by Emily Dickinson. So we must keep apart, you there, I here, with just the door ajar that oceans are, and prayer, and that pale sustenance, despair. From Hunger by Emily Dickinson. I had been hungry all the years. My noon had come. To dine, I, trembling, drew the table near and touched the curious wine. She left the world the same way she had entered it, swathed in robes of scarlet, so red and angry and portentous as to be mistaken for black. The latter crimson swaddling was the result of a ruptured placenta, a condition which separated mother from daughter for hours while the doctors worked to staunch the flow, and which nearly left the 7-pound infant motherless from the moment she took her very first wailing breath. The former was a dirty, ruby-colored wash that spread like a morbid ink blot a few inches up the concave line of her taut stomach and dragged the edges of her white t-shirt into the shallow pool of water where I found her. She was anchored in a bathtub so small she had to bend her long legs. Beneath the water, the bottom of her jeans and her perfect, manicured feet were indistinct and suffused with carnelian. I tried not to look at her, not to notice the droop of her pale, waxy arm, or her skin like rice paper, dotted with fine, translucent hairs. She was so white against all that blood, so white and small and sad that the thought fled through my mind that she was floating in wine, an attempt at salvation instead of blood. Maybe someone, the thought made my heart seize agonizingly with hope, had touched her lips with Eucharist wine. Maybe she was too sick for the host, but someone had still taken pity on her and offered viaticum with a vintage so sacred it drowned her in forgiveness. I could almost imagine dipping a fine-stemmed glass beneath the surface and lifting the heady Merlot to my lips. A toast to a grand entrance now bookended by an even grander exit. Instead, I vomited into the toilet beside her upturned wrist. Later, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand, I sat beside her and watched her face. I was waiting, maybe for a flicker, the smallest breath of movement across her carved features, but I knew she was long gone. She had tried to close her eyes at the end, and her lashes almost rested against smooth, unlined cheeks the exact color of Gulf sand. There were no tracks of tears streaking her perfect skin, and her lips were even slightly parted in the semblance of a half-smile, a secret crescent moon of understanding, as if she knew something I didn't. I wanted to shake her. Why? What do you know? Or, more importantly, how could you? But I didn't shake her. I couldn't. She was my waking nightmare, lying there with the razor positioned perfectly on the edge of the white porcelain tub, and 2 bloody fingerprints beside it, as if she had touched the pads of her fingers there on purpose. A signature of sorts. The dips and whirls and admission, her own posthumous confession to the crime she had committed. There was something in me that hated her for what she had done. But beneath that, and rising, swelling upward and outward in a dark, smoky thunderhead of impenetrable clouds, was grief. Consuming, enveloping, absolute grief. When I began to scream, it echoed through the glass-tiled bathroom like thunder. Chapter 1. Abigail Bennett was the definition of unexpected. She was 1 year on the wrong side of the knife blade that was 30. But if she turned up at your restaurant and ordered a glass of wine, even high-heeled and clad in a black sheath, you'd card her every time. Petite and narrow-waisted, with a pixie flip of hair the exact color of coffee beans, Abigail could easily pass for 16 in a pair of ripped jeans and an Abercrombie t-shirt. Not that she liked looking younger than her age. In fact, most of the time, Abigail hated the constant reminders that no matter what she did or where she went, she would not be taken seriously. This explained the harsh line of bobby pins that held her wayward hair out of her face, as if the severity of it could add years. It also explained the almost dowdy clothes, the earth-toned makeup, and the hard, thin line of a mouth that could have been very beautiful. Once people got past the fact that she wasn't a teenager, Abigail looked very much like the ideal kindergarten teacher. Her stature and dress were the opposite of intimidating, yet there was a spark in her dark eyes, as if from time to time a match was struck behind the velvety chocolate of her corneas. These eyes could freeze hell over with a well-timed look, a piercing arrow of unmistakable meaning. But there was also a hint of tenderness in Abigail that translated into quiet strength when paired with the sharp edges that were inevitably unveiled before anyone had a chance to form a false opinion of her. But then again, maybe it was all a facade. She didn't let people get close enough to find out. In reality, Abigail was not a kindergarten teacher, nor could she remember a phase in her life when she ever wanted to be one. She was an accountant. Numbers were stable, unchanging, and, best of all, incapable of being mysterious or of forcing people to act and think and feel in ways that they would not normally act and think and feel. Numbers were predictable. People were not. And because Abigail trusted the reliability of her chosen field, she was good at her job, meticulous, and capable of holding the smallest detail in her mind for as long as it was useful. During tax season, Abigail worked more hours than anyone else at her firm, and that was saying a lot. It was why she was made a partner after only 5 years with the company, and why she occupied one of 2 corner offices, the one with a view of the swampy man-made pond that graced the complex of professional stucco buildings on Key Point Drive. Johnson, McNally, and Bennett was a Rosa Beach institution, and though Blake Johnson and Colton McNally could claim most of the honor behind their prestigious position in the community, Abigail knew she filled an important and indispensable role. Southern Florida had its share of widows and divorcees, and for some not-so-surprising reasons, they preferred to have a woman handle their money. Abigail was happy to oblige. It kept her busy and the firm in business. Keeping busy was what Abigail did best. When she wasn't working, which averaged 60 hours a week, She was either running or reheating days-old Chinese takeout in a dented wok. Both activities were little more than a personal experiment. They were representative of the only two things in Abigail's life that she really, deep down, hoped to accomplish someday: run a marathon and learn to cook. The marathon was a goal that she had already partly achieved. On the day of her 29th birthday, she ran a half marathon in Miami. Abigail could have easily completed it, and in fact, the finish line was in sight, only 2 blocks ahead, when she realized it was enough to know that she could do it. Crossing the finish line would have meant that she ran for someone else, that she ran for the glory, the recognition. So Abigail had slowed down a little, and then a bit more, until someone thrust a cup of water in her hand and yelled, "You're almost there!" She smiled her thanks, sipped the water, and folded herself into the crowd while all eyes were watching the other runners throw their arms into the air for the last few triumphant yards. The cooking, on the other hand, was little more than a pipe dream. Abigail's greatest accomplishment was adding a diced chicken breast and some soy sauce to leftover chicken chow mein. It was too salty. But propped on her counter in an antique wrought-iron bookstand was a Williams-Sonoma cookbook with full-color photographs and extensive instructions on how to cook homemade delicacies like potato gnocchi with wild mushroom sauce and baked clams with pine nuts and basil. Every morning, while she waited for the last few drops of coffee to drip into her Javalia carafe, Abigail would thumb through the glossy pages of the cookbook and imagine what it would be like to make a wine reduction sauce as the sound of laughter filled her apartment. Someday, she told herself. And though there were many somedays in Abigail's life, she tried not to let the particulars of her existence get her down too much. It didn't matter that she didn't have a boyfriend. It didn't matter that every day plodded on with the same pitfalls and small successes. It didn't matter that her apartment was quiet but for the hum of her empty stainless steel refrigerator. It was the life that Abigail had chosen, and she was a grim optimist, resigned to the path she was on. She was getting exactly what she had always wanted. So what if it was tilted heavily toward work, personal discipline, solitude? So what if it left little room for the things other people craved? So what if her cupboards were as bare of exotic ingredients as her apartment was bare of cheerful company? But sometimes, alone in her apartment with the shades drawn tight, Abigail would stand in front of the full-length mirror on the back of her bathroom door and relax enough to admire what she saw. Tousling her wet hair and practicing a self-conscious smile that showed her teeth, her impossibly white, perfectly straight teeth that were a genetic legacy instead of the result of extensive dental work, Abigail could almost pretend that she was 10 years younger and that the world was unfurling itself before her. For those moments in the steam and warmth, dark ringlets of hair curling around her temples as if she were some Grecian empress, Abigail wished much more for herself than what she had. She wished that she could rewind the clock and find Abby, the girl she used to be, perched on the cusp of her life instead of entrenched in the middle of it with no apparent way out. Every once in a while, she could gather the courage to admit that it would have been a very different life if she had to do it all over again. When Abigail first came to Johnson and McNally, she had a chance at a different life. It was no secret around the office that Colton McNally had a thing for the new accountant. He was 12 years older than Abigail and divorced, and that seemed somehow estimable according to Abigail's less-than-high expectations. It wasn't that she would settle for just anyone, but she also didn't enter into much of anything with a long list of prerequisites. In truth, Abigail found Colton very attractive. She thought his salt and pepper hair was distinguished, even though she suspected it came from the hands of a very talented colorist, as he wasn't quite 40, and she liked the way his tailored suits fell across the straight line of his shoulders. Best of all, he was nothing like the immature, self-absorbed boys Abigail had dated in college. They had nearly turned her off men altogether. So when Colton turned his attention toward her, Abigail let him flirt. For a while, she even stopped wearing the stern bobby pins so that her dark curls framed her rather nicely arched forehead. And yet, Abigail wasn't naive. She knew that her employer loved her because of the photo. It would have been too much to ask for Colton to love her, or at least think he did because of herself. But while she probably should have been reticent of attention resulting from such a faint and improbable notion, Abigail accepted, almost expected, the source of Colton's desire. The photograph in question hung neatly squared and centered on a fabric-covered board adorning the west wall in the reception room. It was a concession to the more traditional bulletin board, replete with employee photographs that were intended to look candid, but often looked overposed. Abigail knew of the board. She even shot glances at it whenever she could to detect updates and changes, but she was not aware, upon settling into her position, that tradition dictated a spot for her photo front and center ASAP. It was her third day of work, and Abigail was immersed in balancing infinitesimal details, worlds away from the air-conditioned office she inhabited when Colton startled her with a quiet ahem. Her head was bowed, and her forearms rested on endless pages that sprouted like an unruly crop of paper weeds across her generous desk. Abigail blinked and raised her eyes, just her eyes, in time to be blinded by the flash of Colton's expensive Canon. He laughed and snapped a few more pictures, for which she cleared off her desk, sat up straight and smiled, thin-lipped and toothy and even coy, trying them all in the hopes that one would be right. But the next day, Abigail was surprised to see that the photo gracing the quasi-bulletin board was the first one of the batch. She knew she was looking at herself because seeing the small, hunched form over the crowded desk was a sort of déjà vu. She had been there before. If not for that, Abigail would have never believed that the woman staring back at her was her own reflection. The woman in the photograph had luminous, there was simply no other word for them, luminous black eyes of the starry sky variety, endless and opalescent and dark like a time before the Genesis. Like the event horizon of identical black holes, no way out, but no matter, for who would ever want to leave? Beneath the twin universes of those eyes, her lips were slightly parted, pink and full and evocative of bruised raspberries. Her skin glowed faintly, fluorescent light reflecting off all that white paper, and her shadowy curls were framing and soft. The woman was lovely. But what unnerved Abigail the most was that Colton had caught her at a moment between. A rare, uncovered moment between expressions, a moment of evaporation before the advent of her surprise became the dutiful smile that spread across her face in the split second after the shutter snapped. This woman was a living mystery. Abigail wished she knew her. One day, a few months after she had started at the firm, Abigail went into Colton's office to ask him a question about the tax return of a dual citizen living out of country. It was a legitimate question, but Blake's office was closer than Colton's, and her admirer acknowledged the fact the second Abigail rapped her knuckles on the doorframe. She realized almost too late that her presence would be read as an invitation, and sure enough, a smile unfolded across Colton's face, like a flag pulled taut in a billowing wind. "Come in, Abigail. Why don't you close the door behind you? There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." Abigail did as she was told and crossed the plush, carpeted floor of Colton's office with her heart stuck fast in her throat. "But first," Colton set aside what he had been working on, "what can I do for you?" Passing him the papers, Abigail lowered herself to balance on the arm of one of the leather chairs facing the wide black walnut desk. But Colton raised an eyebrow at her, motioned that she should cross behind the desk to stand beside him. They had flirted before, secret half-smiles conveyed across crowded rooms and careful conversations littered with possibilities, and it seemed that the unmistakable chemistry between Colton and Abigail was a favorite topic around the water cooler, boasting far more people in favor of a match than against it. It was also impossible for Abigail not to get caught up in it a little. But she also couldn't help being cautious. And suddenly, with the door closed and Colton looking far more handsome than she remembered from only the day before, she knew that he was a man who wouldn't play games for long. Colton waved her over again, and Abigail moved slowly, explaining about the non-resident and his recent payout from a life insurance death benefit. She had just gotten to the part where he intended to give enough of it away to slip below the line of taxable income when Colton grabbed her wrist and, in one smooth movement, pulled her forward until her face was inches from his. He studied her, still smiling, then kissed her full on the mouth as if he had been intending to do so for a long time. It wasn't that Abigail didn't want to kiss him back. Actually, quite the opposite. It wasn't even that she was stunned by the inappropriateness of such a gesture. Instead, it was a tic-tac that ruined everything, a burning little grain of peppermint that she inhaled when Colton's lips touched hers. She drew back, pulling out of Colton's embrace and coughing violently until tears collected at the corners of her eyes. Abigail struggled for a moment, choking mutely as she watched Colton bolt out of his chair and grab her upper arms. When the breath mint was dislodged from her throat, and she could feel it hot and peppery on her tongue, she knew it was a very small thing that would be significant in ways that might cause her years of lament. "I'm sorry," Abigail murmured, utterly mortified for one of the first times she could remember. She couldn't continue. Colton stared at her, concern and disbelief gathering fog-like across his forehead. At first, Abigail thought he might fold her into his arms, that the almost pitiable comedy of what had just happened would become the sort of story they laughed about months down the road when they told people the tale of how they came together. But then Colton laughed, rubbing his hands up and down her arms. The moment shattered and fell away, disappearing in a shimmer of doubt that made Abigail wonder if she had merely dreamed it. "As long as you're okay," he boomed. And then he sat back down and pretended nothing had happened. He never mentioned it again, and neither did she. 18 months later, Colton married Marguerite, the receptionist who was hired at the same time as Abigail. Marguerite was a few years younger than Abigail, but she looked much older due to a succession of bad dye jobs and what appeared to be a lifetime of sun damage spotting her skin. Colton seemed happy. From what little Abigail could discern of her boss's marriage, he genuinely longed for companionship, and Marguerite's horse-like laugh didn't turn him off so much that he considered her a poor match. Although it was against her nature, shortly after the happy couple's beach wedding, Abigail went through a brief stage where she fixated on what might have been. The entire office had once been invited to Colton's sprawling house, only a block off the ocean, and Abigail could almost picture herself the mistress of his columned colonial. What sort of woman would she be if she were Mrs. McNally? What would she look like offering guests a second martini and lounging in some bright sari that she had bought on their honeymoon? It was a nice scenario, but Abigail wasn't one to waste too much energy on regret, and she abandoned such nonsense the same way she set aside every other impossible dream. She placed it firmly out of her mind. A few years later, when Blake and Colton approached her about being a partner, she was even able to congratulate herself that her business card would read Johnson, McNally and Bennett instead of Johnson, McNally and McNally. She convinced herself that it was much more satisfying this way. For his part, after their less than romantic encounter in his office, Colton was nothing but a gentleman to Abigail. He treated her with the same respect, the same quiet yet somehow condescending pride of a father figure. Abigail was reduced from a possible lover to the discarded role of a dependable daughter. It was a character she was rather good at playing. Lou Bennett was a father when he could have been a grandfather. He met Melody Van Bemmel at Chevy's Cafe a week after he turned 45. It was nearly a blizzard outside, and she blew into the warm restaurant off balance and trembling as if she were a leaf driven by the vicious wind. When the door slammed behind her, Melody gasped, stomped her booted feet, and flung the hood of her parka back. She smiled shyly, looking around as if her entrance had been staged, as if she were taking her place beneath the spotlight, and now that she was front and center, she had forgotten her lines. Everyone in the cafe glanced up at her for the blink of an eye, and then turned back to their coffees and specials of the day without a second thought. Everyone except Lou. He had fallen in love the moment Melody raised her hands to turn back her hood. They were little hands, swimming in a pair of men's work gloves that were so big on her fingers they nearly slid off. Lou imagined they were his gloves. He wished they were. And, just as quickly as he longed for her, Lou hated himself for it. She was a child. Her eyes were too clear, her skin too bright for her to even look twice at a man whose own skin was as deeply lined as those etchings he had seen on display in the American National Bank. But when she caught his eye, when her lips pulled up slightly just for him, Lou knew there was nothing that could be done about it. He was hers, even if she never acknowledged his existence. Even if he loved her in secret until the day he died. As it turned out, he didn't have to. Melody came to Lou in the most natural, ordinary way. She brushed against the edge of his life and found herself inexorably pulled in. He didn't even know he was drowning until he felt himself reach for her and cling for dear life. They were married less than a year later, and though Melody was not as young as Lou had imagined, when she walked down the aisle in a confection of white, a little shiver crept up Lou's spine because she did not look 25. 20 years, he thought, in the second before the preacher asked him if he would have her and hold her until death do you part. Lou said, "I do," without hesitation, but somewhere in the back of his mind he faltered. There was a nagging suspicion, an accusatory guilt that made him wonder if he had made her the happiest woman alive like she claimed, or if he had involuntarily ruined her life. It took Melody almost 6 years to get pregnant, though they tried to make a baby on their wedding night. She saw doctors and gynecologists and fertility specialists, but no one could tell her why her womb would not swell with a child. For a while, Lou entertained the possibility of joining her at one of her appointments, but those sorts of things made him unbearably uncomfortable. He avoided the conversation he knew Melody wanted to have, the same way that he avoided the drawer where she kept her neat pile of lace-trimmed underwear. When Lou was 51, Melody's cheeks took on a greenish hue in the early morning, and the waist that he so loved to encompass in his enormous hands began to expand. She wouldn't admit it at first. Maybe she was scared to hope, but Lou knew almost immediately. Something about Melody had changed, the scent of her skin or the complexity of the air around her when she entered a room. Maybe both. Either way, Lou was relieved. It wasn't him, it had never been him, and now she would be happy. They would be a family. Lou didn't think much about the baby until the doctor handed him a tiny, tightly wrapped bundle with a pink cap sliding down over her lashless eyes. They were two little commas, those eyes, a break amidst all the words that comprised his many years of life, though certainly not a beginning or even an end. Lou stared at her and realized that he had planned on having a son. "Abigail Rose," Melody called weakly from the bed. She smiled at him with all the energy she could muster, and her eyes were dancing with tears. "Rose, for my mother, and Abigail because it's the most beautiful name I've ever heard. I think we'll call her Abby." What was there to say? It was a fine name, and Lou hadn't wasted a single thought on another. "Pretty," he said finally, and brushed his lips tentatively across the soft forehead because it seemed like the right thing to do. I didn't know what to do with her. She was cold. Her skin was so cold, and she seemed dirty to me. I wanted to wash her hair and make her lips look pink again instead of the sickly gray that taunted me for not getting here sooner, for not paying attention, for not being everything she needed me to be. When I got over the initial shock, when I had cried so hard I had emptied myself of every fighting, aching thing inside, I moved her arm half a degree and sat on the edge of the bathtub so I could be near her. There was nothing to be afraid of. This body beside me was only an empty shell. She was gone, and yet I wanted to be close enough to study every detail. I wanted to imprint her on each scribbled page of my memory so that when they took her away, I could remember how her collarbones rose in mirrored harmony and almost met in the shadow of her long neck. My skin was tight from crying, and I could taste the salt from my tears when I licked my lips. There was blood, too, and it was insulting somehow that I could feel the metallic tang of life on my tongue when hers was spilled beneath me. Then I felt a jolt of shock at the blood in my mouth. How did it get there? Had I bled with her? Had I inadvertently touched where she lay, broken, and partaken in some unholy communion? I raised my palms and studied their whiteness, then put them to my face and knew. The edges of my mouth were cracked from forming the scream that tried to clear a way for my heart to leave my body. It would have climbed up through my throat and escaped. It wanted to. I could feel it thrashing around, dying for an exit, a way to escape this pain. But it was held fast by each vein that anchored it to my fingers, my toes, the rest of my numb body. The blood in my mouth was my own. It took me what felt like hours to reach for her. and when I did, her fingers were firm and limp, like molded plastic as I wrapped my hands around them. I fought back my revulsion and reminded myself of who she was. Rubbing her lifeless hand between my own warm ones, I willed her to squeeze me back, even as I knew she never would. A longing stabbed through me and was gone. I want to be where you are. But that was impossible. I would have to live in this new reality. I didn't know what to do without her. Chapter 2. Abigail left everything when she went to find Tyler. At first, she convinced herself that she could forget about him. She told herself that this consuming, breathing thing inside her would slowly fold and fade and crumble away so that she could live again. But instead of eventually cooling into ash and ember, the flame that had been lit for the elusive Tyler only fanned into something burning and fierce. In the end, Abigail didn't really even have a choice. She went because she had to. It happened almost unexpectedly, the leaving. And when Abigail turned off the final light in her apartment and drank in one last long look as the sunset laid an offering of orange flowers across her honeyed laminate floors, she felt like she was saying goodbye for good. And then the cat, the tabby stray she had adopted and forgotten to name, brushed against her legs, and she realized that she almost left it to die behind locked doors. "Pretty girl," she murmured absently, picking it up and pressing her face into the ginger fuzz. "You can't come with me." Abigail carried the cat outside under one arm and pulled her sleek suitcase on wheels with the other. One item would find its way into the trunk of her midnight blue Passat. The other she could hardly bring herself to think about. Maybe the nice men working for the Department of Homeland Security wouldn't notice a cat hiding in her calfskin attaché. It was difficult to balance the cat as Abigail descended the 2 flights of stairs and slid a shiny silver key into her mailbox for the last time in weeks. Maybe months. She had put a hold on her mail, but Abigail knew there was a small accumulation of post that she had been ignoring for several days. They had told her that she could expect the parcel in 8 to 10 weeks. For exactly 2.5 months, every time she slipped her hand inside the tall metal cavern that contained nothing more threatening than paper and envelopes, Abigail's heart wrenched, and she had to force herself to stand still. This time, as she was leaving, Abigail hardly gave the package a second thought. And there it was. Her fingers stalled for a moment on the manila envelope, then withdrew so quickly it seemed there was poison on the heavy-grained paper that stung her skin. "Not now," Abigail whispered. The cat mewed in reply. "Shh," she murmured. The deliberate hushing could have been meant for the cat. It could have been meant for Abigail. She stood there, staring at the mailbox for what seemed like hours. Finally, Abigail thrust her hand back in the cool mail slot and grabbed everything without looking at it. Jiggling the attaché on her shoulder, she unzipped it with her arm bent corkscrew-like and jammed the papers inside. She stuffed the manila envelope down deep, sliding it between a slim folder and a bunch of maps she had printed off that resided in the niche usually reserved for her laptop. Slamming her mailbox closed, Abigail strode out of the building, trying with each purposeful step to fight the slick veneer of nausea that the envelope had spilled down her throat. "Going away?" The unexpected voice seemed disembodied. When Abigail turned, She saw the neighbor girl perched on one of the benches in the shade of the pergola crowning the entrance to Gulf Wind Estates. She was 12 or 13 years old, and Abigail could never remember her name. Sierra or Sienna? Maybe Savannah. Something southern and airy, like a slow exhalation. "Yes," Abigail said, trying to coax a smile onto her face. This was a welcome distraction. "I forgot to find a kennel for—" She fumbled, struggling to lift the plump cat a bit higher. The girl's eyes widened. Her legs were crossed beneath her, but she lowered them now, putting her hands on her knees as if she was waiting for Abigail to say something else. "Do you know—" Abigail started and then drifted off because she didn't know what else to say. "How long are you going to be gone?" the girl asked. "I don't know." The girl had long, blonde hair, like a cascade of sun-drenched water, and sitting as she was in the fading evening light, Abigail thought her very striking. Abigail's breath caught in her throat for a second, and she swallowed with difficulty, suddenly eager to escape the strange conversation with her anonymous neighbor. But then the girl swept her hair over her shoulder and secured it in a ponytail with an elastic band she had looped around her wrist. Any resemblance to the ghost that haunted Abigail's dreams immediately disappeared. "I'll take care of your cat," the girl said without preamble. She didn't put out her arms for the tabby, though it looked like she wanted to, like she was stopping herself from doing so. Abigail didn't feel quite right about it, but what choice did she have? She knew she should ask the girl if it would be okay with her parents, or better yet, she should ask the parents herself, but it seemed too complicated an endeavor. Instead of opening her mouth to form a single question, Abigail nodded slowly and took a step toward the girl. The young lady stood and reached for the cat, smiling as she accepted the ball of fluff and tucked it into her thin arms. "What's her name?" "Whatever you want it to be," Abigail answered. Her reply echoed in her own ears like a tacky pickup line. She tried to soften it a bit. "I just called her Cat." "We can do better than that, can't we?" the girl whispered, burying her nose in the scruff of furry neck. Abigail wavered for a minute before walking away. It was easy, almost too easy to leave. The cat was a charade of connection, an artificial reason to stay that resolved itself without any effort on her part. Abigail had already said her goodbyes. There were no complicated loose ends to tie up. There was nothing to worry about. There was no one for her to miss when she was gone, or anyone to miss her. Everything she was leaving behind was as unnamed as the girl and her cat. Meaningless. Vague. Taking a deep breath, Abigail sliced through whatever slim bonds had tried to hold her back. She felt like she was emerging from the hazy aftermath of a storm. As the sun set, it jettisoned thick shafts of brilliant light, bright and furious in their daily closing rite, across the earth below. It was so piercingly splendid in the moment before the horizon swallowed the scarlet sun whole that it was almost as if it was all. The cat, the sunset, the impending absence, an act of intention. All of it seemed purposed to break through the soft, gray mists that clung like cobwebs to Abigail. It illuminated with startling intensity the only thing she sought: Tyler. Leaving Florida to chase after Tyler was something Abigail never planned on doing. But obsession is rarely premeditated. And by the time she admitted that her life could not go on as long as Tyler only existed nebulous and uncertain in the shadowy corners of her mind, he was already gone. Abigail had tracked him down to a modern apartment building that was only blocks away from the beach. In fact, it was so close to the ocean that as she walked the tree-lined street to Tyler's Tuscan-style apartment complex, she caught glimpses of white-capped waves frothing the surface of the blue herringbone Gulf water. There was a slight breeze chasing itself around the corners of the rambling houses in the upscale neighborhood, and it would lift Abigail's cropped hair off her neck and cool her skin. She stifled a shiver, knowing that the soft wind on land was a mighty force to be reckoned with over the waters she could see in the distance. The water frightened her a little, and though the ocean was one of the primary reasons Abigail had left Newcastle, Minnesota, her prairie blood had never quite warmed to the fathomless depths that surrounded her on 3 sides. When she first moved to Rosa Beach, Abigail had a recurring nightmare that included a tsunami wiping Florida off the map. In her dream, she was standing in a parking lot with bags of groceries slung over her arms. Suddenly the sky went dark, and she looked up to see the wave, an impenetrable fortress of black water, swell and spread as if it would consume the heavens before crushing the earth. All at once, people screamed and ran for their lives, but Abigail was frozen by the immensity of the water and traumatized by the fact that it could stand there upright, as if it lived and had risen out of the sea to stalk her. She dropped her groceries and strangely felt a surge of worry that the crusty baguette she had just purchased would get soggy. And then it began to sprinkle, the top curl of the churning wave dripping and crying in anticipation of crashing, and Abigail felt the full weight of the knowledge that she was about to drown. The horror was so absolute, the fear so real and consuming that Abigail would inevitably wake up. She would be gasping and damp, sure that she was dying in the second before she realized that the paved parking lot beneath her was really her stiff-mattressed bed, and that the drops on her skin were sweat and not seawater. The nightmare eventually began to taper off, haunting Abigail less and less frequently until it was nothing more than the memory of a feeling, a sour aftertaste that lingered in her soul and could not quite be identified. But something about Florida forever felt changed to Abigail. It was as if the state was a floating, unstable peninsula. She stumbled at times, sure she felt the movement. Approaching Tyler's apartment, desperate to see him, yet afraid of that very thing, Abigail was actually forced to stop and steady herself against the trunk of a tree. She fitted her fingers against the bark and swayed once, an unwilling dance partner. But Abigail was a grown woman, and this feebleness was nonsense. She forced it out of her mind and angled her steps away from the distant patch of sea. As it turned out, Abigail need not have expended such agony. Tyler didn't live there anymore. His roommate, an attractive young man who was adjusting a neat, cranberry-colored raw silk tie, informed Abigail that Tyler had moved out several weeks earlier. "And I don't think he's coming back," the man offered, trying out a charming smile on Abigail to see how she would respond to his subtle flirtation. Shock must have rippled visibly across her face, because the man smoothed his pinstriped charcoal shirt with an irritating flick of his wrist and said, "Lover? What, he didn't leave you his number?" In accordance with the sarcastic note in his voice, Abigail half expected him to add a caustic "boo-hoo" or some other less than sincere condolence. And though she didn't want to beg, though she didn't want to give this man the satisfaction of knowing that she sought Tyler with a steadily growing passion, she asked quietly, "Do you know where he is?" The man sighed hard through his nose and put his hands on his hips. "You know, you're not the first girl to come looking for him." "I don't care," Abigail said evenly. "You can do a lot better than him, pretty thing like you." "It's not—" But Abigail couldn't finish. She didn't know how to explain it all. "I just really need to talk to him." "I don't have a phone number, sorry." "An address?" she pressed. He smiled wryly and gave in. "I'm supposed to send some of his stuff to him. What do you think? Tyler and I are a pretty close fit, wouldn't you say?" He held out his arms and admired his own outfit. "I guarantee you, I look way better in it than he ever did." Abigail gave him a stiff nod. Rolling his eyes, he moved to shut the door in her face. "Stay here. I'll see if I can find that stupid address. You can have it, and I'll pretend I lost it." Waiting for Tyler's ex-roommate to return was a taste of eternity for Abigail. If he didn't have what she was looking for, she didn't know what she'd do. She was hardly a detective, and the only things she had that even assured her that Tyler was real and not some creation of her overactive imagination were his name and a photograph of his striking face in profile. Some of the panic that Abigail had left behind at the foot of the tree only steps from his front door began to creep up the sidewalk to claim her. If he didn't have the address, if it was lost, or he was lying, or he refused to give it to her, what next? All her days up until this point had led to this one place in her life, and Abigail could not see another future no matter how hard she tried. But then the door swung open, and the man thrust a rumpled receipt at her. "For what it's worth, I wouldn't waste another second on him if I were you." "Thank you," Abigail muttered thinly. "I'd say good luck, but I wouldn't mean it." He shut the door for a second time, and Abigail heard a deadbolt slide home. Numb and suppressing a shudder that would quickly become a tremor throughout her entire body, Abigail looked down at the address, scrawled in slightly smeared blue ink. Gia's Bakery and European Deli, 5467 Crescent Drive, Surrey, British Columbia, V4S 2H2, Canada. Canada? She hadn't expected that. Nothing in Lou's life was quite how he expected it would be. Sure that he was destined to be single forever, Melody had been an apparition that slowly took shape in his reality. She was all mist and magic in the beginning, but she solidified a little every day, reversing the normal pattern of life and becoming more real, more present and vivid and possible as the years progressed. What had once seemed impossible was now a beautiful, breathing actuality. When they were newly married, Lou woke up every morning half expecting his wife to have dissolved as his dreams slunk away in the fading night. But there she was, day after day and week after week, until one morning he woke up and knew that she would be there. Lou wasn't dreaming it. He was living it. Then Abby came. She was quiet and contemplative for a child, but she was still a child, and suddenly the unexpected bliss of 6 unimaginable years was interrupted by nighttime feedings and the impulsive needs of a newborn. Lou didn't resent his daughter, not exactly, but she arrived at a time in his life when most of his friends were empty nesters, or even grandparents who could coddle the children in their lives for small bits of time before returning them to their mothers. For Lou, it was as if God rewound the clock, but forgot to rewind Lou. In the split second after the doctor announced, "It's a girl," Lou was transformed into an old husband playing the role of a young one. and a new father on top of it all. So, he quit the farm. Just like that. He harvested the corn and soybeans for the last time while Melody nursed and cooed over her precious infant, and then he called the only realtor he knew and listed the farm. "What have you done?" Melody cried when she learned that the farm was for sale. And she was crying, huge, shining tears that Lou wiped away with his calloused thumbs. "It's for the best," he said. Though what he meant was, I have to do something. How could life go on as it always had when the truth was that it would forever be changed? The farm was an emblem to the way it had been and could never be again. It was a living photo album of sorts, for Lou couldn't look at the sagging fence around the pasture without seeing Melody standing on the bottom rung, hands on her hips as she balanced, and her hair stroked wild by the wind. He couldn't see the freshly painted barn without watching his wife, remarkable and forever preserved in his mind's eye, color the splintering wood with her own carefully wielded brush. She was everywhere he looked, and he wanted it to remain that way. He didn't know if there was room for Abby in his dream of Melody. So Lou tried to invent a new dream. It had to change, all of it, and he knew that one truth as certainly as he knew that the sun would continue to rise in the east. "We're moving to town. I'm getting a steady job. We're going to church." He ticked off each imperative, calculating and measuring out ingredients that, if left to simmer, would create the perfect life. Lou figured he could love Abby if he could only make room for her, if he set aside all that had been and focused hard on all that could be. The farm sold quickly, but only because Lou was willing to take less than what it was worth. By the time the final papers were signed and initialed, Melody had warmed up a bit to the idea of moving and had picked out an appealing little two-story only a block from the public library. The siding was lemon yellow, and the former owners had painted the shutters a blinding lime green. Melody chirped that it was cheerful and fun, though when Lou looked at the house, it gave him such an impression of citrus that he actually had to fight a pucker. Finding a job proved more difficult than finding a house, and when Lou and Melody moved in, he still hadn't secured employment. He scoured the local paper for applicable want ads and circled them with a red pen purchased solely for this purpose. But either the job felt beneath him or he felt beneath the job, and Lou couldn't bring himself to drop off a resume. Not that he had a resume. For the first time in his life, Lou felt the beginning twinges of something that threatened to suck him under, a depression with claws. Of course, he had been depressed before, but this felt like depression with a capital D. Just when it became alarming, when Lou could feel regret and bitterness glower menacingly on the horizon, Melody saved him for a second time. "I got us a new phone number," she said one night over supper. Abby was just learning to eat solid food, and pureed peas were lining her mouth like a foul, furry lipstick. Lou found it hard to focus on his wife, but he tore his eyes away from his daughter and tried. "We don't need a new number. We can transfer our old one to this house." "This one is better," Melody smiled. 655-4357. Lou shrugged. "Do you know what 4357 spells?" He shook his head. "Help." "Help?" 655-HELP. It's the phone number for your new business. Temporary, of course, until you work something else out. Now that the confession was over with, Melody seemed afraid of Lou's reaction and explained what she had in mind. "I was thinking about you today, and all that you can do and all that you are, and I decided that you are a jack of all trades." I'm not sure that's a compliment. But it is. You're a jack of all trades and a master of all of them, too. You can do everything from hang drywall to repair small engines. Melody cast around, fumbling to encompass everything. To fix the kitchen sink.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.